The first rays of dawn painted the countryside in pale gold, glinting off the dusty windows of the small, weather-beaten cottage at the edge of the village. Inside, Elena moved quietly, her bare feet brushing the rough wooden floor as she tried not to wake the twins sleeping in a faded wicker cradle. Their tiny hands twitched as they dreamed, their soft breaths filling the room with a fragile rhythm. For Elena, these moments were a fleeting peace. Soon, the world outside would intrude. Outside, a sleek black car glided up the narrow dirt path, its tires crunching against the gravel in a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. Standing tall behind it was Adrian Cole, the billionaire known throughout the city as a man who rarely hesitated and never forgave. His black suit pressed perfectly against his frame, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the crumbling cottage before him. To him, it was nothing more than a problem, a plot of land standing between him and another skyscraper, another luxury resort, another symbol of his empire. Elena heard the knock before she saw the car. Her heart thumped violently in her chest, and instinctively, she pulled the blanket tighter around her twins. One peered at her through half-closed eyelids, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispering a soft apology that barely left her lips. "I'm sorry, little ones," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'll protect you, I promise." When she opened the door, Adrian's eyes fell on her instantly. She was small, almost fragile, with hair tied back in a loose braid and a dress that had long since faded from sun and washing. Her eyes, a soft hazel, looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. The babies, cradled in her arms, stirred slightly, sensing the presence of someone unknown. Adrian expected to feel nothing. He was used to fear, to people bending before him, but instead, something shifted. The sight of her, exhausted yet unbowed, clutching those tiny lives against the harsh morning wind, made him pause. For a moment, he saw not a peasant, not a tenant, not a problem, but a mother fighting against impossible odds. "Good morning," he said, voice crisp, formal. "I'm here about the property. You have to leave." His words were smooth, practiced, but the softness in her expression made him falter, just slightly. Elena shook her head, holding the twins closer. "This is my home," she said, voice quiet but firm. "I have nowhere else to go. You can't take this from me." A silence fell between them, heavy as the rising sun. His assistant shifted uneasily behind him, papers in hand, ready to present eviction notices and legal documents, ready to enforce his authority. But Adrian didn't move. He only looked at her, at the vulnerability and courage woven together in her small frame, and felt an unfamiliar tug at his chest. The wind stirred, rustling the cracked wooden shutters, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers from the surrounding fields. Elena, sensing the hesitation, straightened her back, her resolve like iron beneath fragile skin. Adrian's lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth, words ready to command her out, but they died before they formed. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned back to his car. 3 days, he said finally, almost under his breath. "You have 3 days to leave." Elena's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and continued fear flickering across her face. She didn't know if 3 days would be enough, but it was more than nothing. And for Adrian, as he walked back to the car, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a seed of doubt, of empathy, of something dangerous and unfamiliar. Something that could change everything. The day passed slowly, stretching each hour into a quiet torment for Elena. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the thin roof of her cottage, and the wind carried the scent of dust and wild grass through the cracked windows. She moved with careful precision, tending to the twins as they slept and feeding them from the small jar of porridge she had managed to prepare. Every movement was measured, every sigh stifled, because she knew the world outside was closing in. Adrian returned later that afternoon, this time without the formal entourage. The sleek black car rolled to a stop at the edge of the property, and he stepped out, hands in his pockets, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up in a rare display of casual ease. He watched her from a distance, hiding behind the shadow of an old oak tree, as she carried water from the well and mended the broken roof with makeshift patches of wood and cloth. He should have seen nothing. She had no power, no influence, no leverage, but he couldn't look away. There was a grace in her struggle, a stubborn strength in the way she handled each task despite exhaustion and despair. She was a woman who had nothing, yet somehow she bore the weight of everything she had. Elena, unaware of his presence, hummed softly to herself as she worked, the sound fragile but steady. One of the twins began to stir, and she paused, holding him close to her chest while smoothing the other's hair with a trembling hand. Even the smallest act of care seemed monumental against the backdrop of poverty and looming eviction. For Adrian, it was mesmerizing. Her assistant, a young man named David, had insisted she could appeal to the authorities, but Elena shook her head at the thought. The law was a distant echo, a set of papers that could not protect her from the power of money. She had only the strength of her own hands, the warmth of her heart, and the love for these two tiny lives. Adrian's mind, normally sharp and calculating, felt suddenly clouded. He remembered the contracts, the blueprints, the meetings where the only goal had been to take the land and maximize profit. Yet, as he watched her stoop to lift a bucket of water, his hands clasped tightly around the rim, he felt a strange compulsion to intervene. He needed, to help, though he had no idea why. A sudden gust of wind shook the cottage, rattling the fragile wooden shutters and sending dust swirling in the sunlight. Elena stumbled, catching herself just before she fell, and the twins began to whimper. Without thinking, Adrian stepped forward from the shadows. "Let me help," he said, his voice lower than before, almost unsure. Elena froze, eyes wide, and for a moment, her fear was palpable. This was the man who had come to evict her, the man whose power could reduce her world to nothing. And yet, now, standing before him, she saw something unexpected, hesitation, even concern. I can manage," she stammered, trying to maintain her dignity while holding the twins tighter. Adrian shook his head. "No, this is dangerous for you, and them." He bent down, lifting the heavier bucket of water with surprising ease and setting it beside her. His presence was awkward but intentional, a mix of authority and something softer, something human. For a moment, they stood there in silence, two worlds colliding in the golden light of afternoon. Elena glanced at him, her eyes searching for motive, for mockery, for anything that would give her an edge in this uncertain encounter. But all she saw was concern, and it unsettled her in ways she could not yet understand. As Adrian walked back toward his car later that day, he felt a heaviness in his chest he hadn't known existed. Watching her fight for survival, watching the raw humanity of her struggle, forced him to question every choice he had made. He had come to evict a tenant. Instead, he found himself confronting a world he had long ignored, a world defined not by wealth or power, but by courage, resilience, and love. The sky darkened that evening with an unusual heaviness, clouds rolling in like a warning. Elena hurried to secure the fragile roof of her cottage, the twins nestled safely against her chest. Every sound, the distant rumble of thunder, the groan of old wood, the whisper of the wind through broken windows, set her nerves on edge. The storm was approaching fast, and the small house, already weakened by years of neglect, would not withstand it. Adrian had returned, this time compelled by something he could neither name nor resist. He drove up the muddy path, leaving the luxury of his car behind to trudge through the fields. The sight of Elena, struggling to keep the roof intact while holding her children, struck a chord deep within him. Without hesitation, he called out to her. "Wait, stop." Elena froze, startled, glancing over her shoulder. Recognition flickered in her eyes, mixed with wariness. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice sharp, yet laced with vulnerability. "I'm helping," he said simply. And though the words were minimal, they carried an uncharacteristic sincerity. The wind whipped around them, tugging at Elena's worn dress and scattering papers from the table she had been using to reinforce the roof. A sudden, violent gust lifted part of the roof, sending splinters flying dangerously close to the twins. Without thinking, Adrian lunged forward, his hands strong and certain, catching the children safely in his arms. Elena gasped, fear and relief mingling in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible over the howl of the storm. The words felt fragile, like glass, yet they resonated with a weight of gratitude she could not hide. Adrian set the twins down gently on the bed, checking them quickly, ensuring their safety. The rain began in earnest, drumming against the roof and walls, turning the tiny cottage into a refuge in the chaos outside. He worked alongside her, patching the worst of the damage, his hands steady and deliberate. There was no hierarchy here, no distinction of wealth or power, only human concern, raw and undeniable. As they worked, Elena finally allowed herself a moment to observe him closely. His tailored suit had been exchanged for a drenched shirt and rolled-up sleeves, his hair plastered to his forehead. There was a determination in his eyes that mirrored her own, but it was tempered with compassion, something she had never seen in someone so wealthy, so untouchable. Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You could leave. You don't have to." "I could," he admitted, pausing to secure a loose beam. "But I didn't. Because someone has to care." His words were simple, but they struck her in a way she could not explain. There was no pretense, no calculation, only an instinctive need to protect the children, to save what she could not save alone. Suddenly, lightning illuminated the room, and the truth hit Adrian in a way that left him breathless. Documents had been left open on a table, old letters, faded photographs, clues of a past intertwined with his own family. Elena's family, humble as they were, had once been protectors of his father, guardians of a man who had shaped the empire he now commanded. And here he was, on the brink of destroying the last remnants of their lives. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. He had come to evict a tenant, to enforce the cold logic of contracts and land deeds, but he now faced something far greater, a living connection to the humanity he had lost somewhere along the way. As the storm raged on, the cottage shuddered but held. Elena, exhausted and soaked, finally allowed herself to lean against him, her trust tentative but present. Adrian, for the first time in decades, felt powerless in the right way, powerless to fix the world, yet compelled to try, compelled to care. In that moment, amid the roaring winds and pouring rain, a fragile bond began to form between them. Not one of wealth or position, but of shared struggle, shared fear, and the undeniable truth that some connections could not be broken, even by the storm. The morning after the storm, the countryside was drenched in a muted, silvery light. Mud clung to Elena's worn shoes, and puddles reflected the gray sky above. Her cottage, battered by the night's tempest, sagged under the weight of water and broken beams. She moved with trembling hands, assessing the damage, the twins resting in a small basket beside her, their tiny faces streaked with sleep and worry. Each broken plank, each soaked curtain was a reminder of her vulnerability, but also of her determination. She had survived worse. Footsteps sounded behind her, firm and purposeful. She turned, instinctively tense, and found Adrian standing there, sleeves rolled up, hands already muddy, eyes resolute. He had not come to observe this time. He had come to act. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, voice steady. "It's not safe." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but the sight of him, soaked from the rain and covered in grime from working on the roof, made her pause. There was no pretense, no arrogance, only a man willing to step into her world, into her struggle, without hesitation. Before she could respond, Adrian moved closer to the cottage, inspecting the damage with a professional's precision. "We'll rebuild this," he said firmly. "Not just fix it, rebuild it properly." Elena's breath caught. You don't have to." "I do," he said. "This is my fault. I was going to take your home, but now I see, it's not just a building. It's your life, your family, everything you've fought for. I can't undo what I tried to do, but I can start by making it right." For the first time, Elena felt the weight of relief press down on her chest. She wanted to protest, to insist that she could manage, but the sincerity in his eyes made words impossible. And as the twins stirred, cooing softly, she realized she no longer had to fight alone. Adrian spent the day helping her clear debris, lifting broken beams, and securing the most dangerous parts of the structure. With every plank he placed, every nail he hammered, Elena saw a transformation, not just in the cottage, but in him. The man who had arrived to evict her was now protecting her, his actions a silent apology, a promise to do better. Later, as they paused for a brief rest, a local worker approached, carrying documents. "Mr. Cole," he said hesitantly, "I think you should see this. There's something about this property, about her family." Adrian's hands tightened around the papers. As he read, shock and recognition spread across his face. Elena's family, the very people who had once protected his own father, had been wronged years ago. He had unknowingly perpetuated a legacy of injustice by attempting to evict their descendant. Guilt, sharp and unrelenting, pierced him. "Elena," he said quietly, showing her the letters and photographs, "I had no idea. Your family. Words failed him, but the message was clear. He would make this right." From that day forward, Adrian transformed his intentions. He rebuilt the cottage with care, turning it into a safe, sturdy home for Elena and the twins. He provided resources for her to manage a small farm on the land, giving her independence and dignity. But more than that, he stayed, visiting daily, laughing with the children, learning to be part of a family he had long forgotten the value of. Elena, too, changed, not because her circumstances had improved alone, but because someone she had feared had become her ally, her protector, and, quietly, someone she could trust. Together, they faced challenges, not as billionaire and peasant, but as two people bound by compassion, respect, and an unexpected connection that neither wealth nor poverty could define. The eviction that had begun as a threat ended as a new beginning. A ruined cottage became a home filled with laughter. Fear and despair gave way to hope and trust. And Adrian, once cold and distant, discovered something more valuable than any fortune, a heart capable of love, humility, and redemption.